In the late 19th century, one man held the entire economy of the United States in the palm of his hand. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt. When he died in 1877, he was worth $100 million. At that time, the entire United States government only had about $2 billion in circulation. This means that Cornelius Vanderbilt personally owned one out of every $20 in the entire country. He was the richest man in America and the undisputed king of the transportation industry. But he did not build his empire through innovation or brilliant inventions. He built his empire through physical intimidation, financial extortion, and absolute ruthless leverage. He was a man who would gladly bankrupt his own friends just to prove a point. He started with a single tiny sailboat and built the largest fleet of steamships in the world. Then at the age of 70, when most men retire, he sold all his ships and took over the railroad industry. He orchestrated the most brutal, hostile takeovers in Wall Street history. When competing companies refused to work with him, he literally cut off their access to the outside world and starved them until they begged him to buy them out. He bought politicians, he bought judges, and he bought entire state governments. This is the story of the original robber baron. This is the story of how a foul-mouthed, uneducated street fighter became the architect of modern corporate warfare. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island in New York. His family was poor, and his father worked as a struggling farmer and a ferryman. Young Cornelius absolutely hated school. He dropped out when he was just 11 years old to work on the freezing waters of the New York harbor. He grew up to be a massive, physically intimidating young man. He was known for swearing heavily and fighting with his bare hands on the docks. When he was 16 years old, he asked his mother for a loan of $100. He promised to plow an entire rocky field on their farm in exchange for the money. His mother agreed to the deal. Cornelius hired his friends to help him plow the field, and he took the $100 to buy his very first boat. It was a small two-masted sailing vessel called a He started his own ferry business, transporting people and cargo from Staten Island to the island of Manhattan. He worked 16 hours a day in the freezing rain and the blistering heat. He charged 18 cents for a single trip. He was incredibly reliable and completely ruthless. If a competing ferryman tried to steal his customers, Cornelius would physically fight them and beat them up. Because of his commanding and aggressive presence on the water, the other sailors gave him a sarcastic nickname. They called him the Commodore. The nickname stuck with him for the rest of his life. By the time he was 18 years old, he had paid back his mother and owned a small fleet of sailboats. He was making a steady income and achieving local success. But the young Commodore was about to learn that hard work and physical strength were not enough to build a real empire. He had to learn how to break the laws of the government. During the early 1800s, the state of New York passed a law that completely destroyed free market competition. The state government granted an absolute legal monopoly to two incredibly powerful men. One was Robert Livingston, a wealthy and connected politician. The other was Robert Fulton, the man who famously invented the commercial steamboat. The government gave these two men the exclusive legal right to operate steamboats in all New York waters. It was a criminal offense for anyone else to use a steamboat without paying them massive fees. Vanderbilt looked at the harbor and realized that his sailboats were obsolete. He knew that steam power was the future of transportation. So he decided to go to work for a wealthy businessman from New Jersey named Thomas Gibbons. Gibbons wanted to run a steamboat ferry from New Jersey into New York, but the Fulton monopoly blocked him. Vanderbilt took the job as the captain of the Gibbons steamboat. His strategy was brilliant and completely illegal. He intentionally drove the steamboat into New York waters every single day, completely defying the supreme law of the state. The New York police and government agents constantly tried to arrest him. Vanderbilt designed a secret hidden closet on the boat where he would hide whenever the authorities boarded the ship. He hired a decoy captain to take the blame and pay the fines, while Vanderbilt steered the massive ship from the shadows. He did this for several years. He turned the operation into a highly profitable illegal enterprise. He dropped the price of the passenger ticket so low that the legal monopoly could not possibly compete. He taught the public to love his illegal service because it was fast, cheap, and reliable. Eventually, the legal battle over this rogue steamboat went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1824, the Supreme Court ruled in the landmark case called Gibbons versus Ogden that the New York monopoly was unconstitutional. Vanderbilt had successfully helped destroy the most powerful monopoly in the country, but he did not destroy the monopoly because he believed in fair competition or free markets. He destroyed it so he could clear the path to build a much larger monopoly of his own. After learning how to run a steamboat empire, Vanderbilt went out on his own. During the 1830s, he built his own massive fleet of luxury steamboats. He operated them on the Hudson River, running from New York City up to Albany. The Hudson River was a highly lucrative trade route, but it was incredibly crowded with competing steamboat companies. Vanderbilt decided he did not want to share the river with anyone. He initiated a completely psychotic price war. The standard fare for a trip up the river was $3. Vanderbilt dropped his price to $1. His competitors matched his price, so Vanderbilt dropped his price to 10 cents. The competitors panicked and matched him again. Then Vanderbilt did the unthinkable. He dropped the price of a passenger ticket to exactly $0. He let people ride the steamboat for absolutely free. The competing companies thought he had lost his mind. They assumed he would go bankrupt in a matter of weeks, but Vanderbilt was an evil genius. While the ticket was free, he quietly raised the prices of the food and the alcohol sold at the bar on the ship. Because the trip took an entire day, the passengers eventually got hungry and thirsty. They ended up paying massive premiums for meals and drinks, allowing Vanderbilt to actually make a profit on a free ticket. His competitors were bleeding cash and facing absolute financial ruin. They finally surrendered. They approached Vanderbilt and begged for mercy. They offered him a massive sum of money just to take his boats and leave the Hudson River. Vanderbilt gladly accepted the bribe. He realized he had just discovered a brand new business model. He did not even need to run a successful business to make money. He could just threaten to destroy a competing business, and they would pay him millions of dollars to go away. He repeated this extortion tactic across different rivers and coastal routes up and down the eastern seaboard, becoming richer and more feared with every single deal. In 1849, the discovery of gold in California completely changed the global economy. Hundreds of thousands of people wanted to travel from New York to San Francisco to strike it rich in the gold rush. But there were no trains that crossed the entire continent. Traveling in a wagon across the desert was incredibly dangerous and took many months. The fastest way to California was by sea. Steamships would travel from New York all the way down to Panama. The passengers would cross the deadly jungles of Panama by foot or by canoe, and then board another ship on the Pacific Ocean to sail up to San Francisco. A massive cartel of steamship companies controlled this Panama route, and they charged ridiculous prices. Vanderbilt saw an opportunity to destroy this cartel. He looked at a map and realized that traveling all the way down to Panama was a waste of time. He saw that the country of Nicaragua was situated much further north and had a massive lake right in the middle of it. He went to the government of Nicaragua and secured the exclusive right to build a transit route across their country. He designed a special steamboat that could navigate the shallow, rocky rivers of the Nicaraguan jungle. He literally drove the first prototype boat up the dangerous rapids himself to prove that it could be done. His new Nicaragua route cut exactly 2 days and 600 miles off the journey to California. He priced his tickets significantly lower than the Panama cartel. Instantly, the accessory transit company became the most popular way to reach the gold rush. Vanderbilt was transporting tens of thousands of passengers and making millions of dollars a year. He was standing at the absolute peak of the maritime shipping industry. He decided he had worked hard enough and wanted to take his very first vacation. It was a decision that would spark an international war. In 1853, Vanderbilt commissioned the construction of a massive luxury steam yacht called the North Star. It was the largest and most expensive private yacht in the world at the time. He packed his entire family onto the ship and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean for a grand tour of Europe. Before he left, he handed the daily management of the accessory transit company over to 2 trusted business partners. Their names were Charles Morgan and Cornelius Garrison. But Morgan and Garrison were greedy, while Vanderbilt was thousands of miles away being treated like royalty. In Europe, these 2 men conspired to steal his company. They manipulated the stock market and used legal loopholes in the corporate charter to completely seize control of the accessory transit company. They ousted Vanderbilt from the board of directors and took all the massive profits for themselves. When Vanderbilt received the news in Europe, he was absolutely furious. Most businessmen would have immediately filed a massive lawsuit in federal court to regain control of their property. But Vanderbilt did not believe in lawyers. He wrote a very short and incredibly famous letter to Morgan and Garrison. The letter read, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I will not sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you." He signed it simply Cornelius Vanderbilt. When he returned to New York, he made good on his promise. He started a brand new steamship line to compete directly against his old company. He slashed prices to the bone and bled them dry. But the situation in Nicaragua was about to become much more complicated and incredibly violent. While Vanderbilt was trying to bankrupt his former partners, a mercenary named William Walker decided to conquer the country of Nicaragua. William Walker was an American adventurer who marched into Nicaragua with a private army of mercenaries. He overthrew the legitimate government and installed himself as the absolute dictator of the country. He legalized slavery and declared English the official language. Morgan and Garrison, the men who stole Vanderbilt's company, made a secret deal with this new dictator. They agreed to pay William Walker massive bribes and transport his weapons and soldiers on their ships. In exchange, Walker revoked Vanderbilt's transit charter and gave it entirely to Morgan and Garrison. Vanderbilt was now dealing with a hostile military dictator blocking his business. He decided to fight fire with fire. He realized that the neighboring country of Costa Rica was terrified of William Walker, so Vanderbilt secretly sent an agent to the government of Costa Rica. He offered to personally fund, arm, and transport the Costa Rican army if they agreed to invade Nicaragua and overthrow William Walker. Vanderbilt was acting as an independent, sovereign nation. He was a private citizen using his own personal wealth to orchestrate a foreign war just to get his transit route back. He sent ships full of modern rifles and ammunition to the Costa Rican forces. He gave them the precise maps and operational details of the steamship network so they could capture the boats on the river. The strategy worked perfectly. The Vanderbilt-backed army captured the vital transit points and cut off the supply lines to William Walker's mercenaries. Walker was completely surrounded, starved of supplies, and forced to surrender. He was later executed by a firing squad in Honduras. Vanderbilt had successfully overthrown a dictator, funded a war, and completely ruined Morgan and Garrison. His revenge was absolute. He took back control of his company and proved to the world that he was more powerful than most global governments. By the time the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Cornelius Vanderbilt was nearly 70 years old. He had conquered the oceans and the rivers. He was the undisputed master of the steamboat industry. But during the war he noticed a massive shift in the mechanics of the economy. He watched trains moving massive amounts of soldiers, weapons, and iron across the country at incredible speeds. He realized that the era of the steamboat was ending, and the era of the iron railroad was beginning. He made a decision that shocked the entire financial world. At an age when most men are physically deteriorating, Vanderbilt decided to start over. He slowly sold off his entire magnificent fleet of steamships. He took all of the capital he had accumulated over 50 years and started buying shares in local railroads around New York. His friends and advisors thought he was losing his mind. They thought the railroad business was too chaotic and completely dominated by corrupt politicians and Wall Street gamblers. But Vanderbilt knew that the principles of monopoly were exactly the same on land as they were on the water. He saw that the railroad industry was fragmented. There were dozens of small disconnected railroads that forced passengers to constantly change trains and wait for hours in the freezing cold. He wanted to buy them all, link them together, and build one massive efficient machine. He started his land conquest with an incredibly neglected and unprofitable railroad called the New York and Harlem. The New York and Harlem Railroad was considered a complete joke by the Wall Street elite. It only ran a short distance up the island of Manhattan, and its tracks were in terrible condition. The stock was trading for exactly $8 a share. Vanderbilt started quietly buying up the stock until he gained a controlling interest. He spent millions of his own dollars fixing the tracks, buying new train cars, and improving the service. Because of these massive improvements, the stock price naturally rose from $8 a share to $100 a share. Vanderbilt then went to the New York City Council members, who were known as the aldermen. He asked them to pass a law allowing him to extend his train tracks all the way down into the southern tip of Manhattan. The corrupt politicians saw an opportunity to make a fortune for themselves. They agreed to pass the law, but they made a secret plan to betray Vanderbilt. Their plan was to use a financial tactic called short selling. When you short sell a stock, you borrow shares from a broker, sell them at the current high price, and promise to buy them back later. If the price drops, you buy them back cheap, return them to the broker, and keep the massive difference as profit. The politicians planned to short sell the Harlem stock at $100 a share. Then they planned to suddenly repeal the law they just passed. They knew that canceling Vanderbilt's expansion would cause a panic, and the stock price would instantly crash. They could then buy the shares back for pennies and become millionaires. It was an absolutely brilliant and totally illegal plan. But someone tipped off the Commodore. Vanderbilt realized exactly what the politicians were doing. Instead of panicking, he unleashed a brutal financial trap. When the politicians started short-selling the stock, Vanderbilt secretly bought every single share they were selling. He used his immense personal wealth to buy the entire available supply of Harlem stock. When the corrupt politicians suddenly repealed the law and waited for the stock to crash, nothing happened. The price did not drop because Vanderbilt owned all the shares, and he simply refused to sell them. The politicians were caught in a trap known as a short squeeze. Because they had borrowed the shares, they were legally obligated to buy them back to return to the brokers. But the only person in the world who owned the shares was Cornelius Vanderbilt. He walked onto the floor of the stock exchange and set the price himself. He demanded $179 for a single share. The politicians were completely ruined. They were forced to pay him astronomical sums of money, facing absolute bankruptcy and public humiliation. Vanderbilt made millions of dollars on the trap and cemented his reputation as the most dangerous man on Wall Street. After destroying the corrupt city politicians, Vanderbilt set his sights on a much larger prize. He wanted the Hudson River Railroad, which ran parallel to his old steamboat routes. He began buying the stock and took control of the company. He requested a simple legal consolidation from the New York State Legislature, located in the capital of Albany. He wanted to officially merge his two railroads to save money on administrative costs. But the exact same thing happened again. A different group of corrupt politicians up in Albany saw what happened in New York City and thought they were smarter than the city aldermen. They also decided to short sell Vanderbilt's stock and then completely block his legal request. They thought he could not possibly have enough money to buy all the shares a second time because the Hudson River Railroad was a much larger and more expensive company. They were dead wrong. Vanderbilt took every single dollar he had, liquidating his remaining ships and borrowing from massive banks. He bought every single share of the Hudson River Railroad. He cornered the market for the second time in 2 years. He drove the price of the stock to $285 a share. The state politicians were financially slaughtered. They begged him for mercy, pleading that they would be sent to debtor's prison and their families would starve. Vanderbilt showed them absolutely no mercy. He squeezed them for every penny they owned, taking all their cash and their property to settle the debts. He had successfully taken over 2 vital railroads and destroyed anyone who tried to stop him. But his ultimate goal was the largest and most powerful railroad in the state, the New York Central. The New York Central Railroad was the crown jewel of American transportation. It ran across the entire state of New York, connecting the massive ports of the east to the booming agricultural markets of the west. Vanderbilt needed the New York Central to complete his empire. He owned the trains that ran from New York City up to Albany. The New York Central owned the trains that ran from Albany to the rest of the country. The two companies had to cooperate. During the warm months, cargo and passengers would arrive in Albany on Vanderbilt's trains and transfer across the river using ferry boats to connect to the New York Central trains. But during the winter, the river froze completely solid. The only way to cross the frozen river was to use a massive bridge. And the New York Central executives absolutely hated Cornelius Vanderbilt. They thought he was a low-class, uneducated thug. They tried to destroy him by completely refusing to connect with his trains during the brutal winter of 1867. They purposefully changed their train schedules so that when Vanderbilt's trains arrived in Albany, the New York Central trains had already departed. The passengers were stranded in the freezing cold, and massive amounts of freight began to pile up and rot in the warehouses. The executives of the New York Central thought this would force Vanderbilt into bankruptcy because his customers would abandon him. They fundamentally misunderstood the man they were fighting. Vanderbilt did not negotiate, and he did not complain. He simply picked up the great hammer of his monopoly and smashed it down on their heads. He sent a telegram to his managers in Albany with a very specific order. He told them to stop running the trains across the bridge. He literally ordered his men to park the trains 2 miles short of the river and refused to move an inch further. This action completely cut off the New York Central from the outside world. Because they could not cross the bridge to reach Vanderbilt's tracks, they could not transport any goods into New York City. The entire agricultural output of the western United States was suddenly blocked from entering the most important economic port in the country. The situation was catastrophic. Passengers had to drag their luggage for miles through the deep snow just to cross the frozen river. Businessmen were screaming and politicians were demanding that the government intervene. But Vanderbilt had carefully read the old laws. He knew there was an obscure law that explicitly stated he was not legally required to run his trains across that specific bridge. He was operating completely within the boundaries of the law. The New York Central bled cash at an astronomical rate. Their stock price completely collapsed as investors panicked and dumped their shares. The arrogant executives who had mocked Vanderbilt were now begging for a meeting. They came to his office and surrendered completely. They handed control of the New York Central over to the Commodore. He had starved a massive corporation into absolute submission by simply refusing to cross a bridge. With the New York Central under his total command, Vanderbilt merged all his holdings into a single massive monopoly. He controlled almost all the rail traffic in the Northeast. But there was one major competitor left, the Erie Railway. The Erie Railway was a massive and deeply corrupt corporation. It was controlled by a man named Daniel Drew. Daniel Drew was a former cattle driver who was just as ruthless and sneaky as Vanderbilt. In fact, years earlier, Daniel Drew had invented the term watered stock. When he was a cattle driver, he would feed his cows salt and then let them drink massive amounts of water right before he sold them. The water made the cows weigh significantly more, allowing him to charge a higher price based on the fake weight. He brought this exact philosophy of selling fake value to Wall Street. Vanderbilt hated Daniel Drew, and he wanted to buy the Erie Railway just to eliminate the final piece of competition. Vanderbilt began executing his classic playbook. He started quietly buying massive amounts of Erie stock on the open market, hoping to corner the supply and seize control of the board of directors. But Daniel Drew saw Vanderbilt coming. Drew enlisted the help of 2 young, brilliant, and completely sociopathic Wall Street operators. Their names were Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. These 3 men decided they were not going to let Vanderbilt take their company. They knew that Vanderbilt had almost infinite money and could buy every share of stock that existed, so they came up with a plan that was absolutely audacious and wildly illegal. If Vanderbilt was going to buy every share of stock, they were simply going to create more shares of stock. The battle that followed became legendary in American financial history and is known as the Erie War. As Vanderbilt bought millions of dollars worth of Erie stock, the price continued to climb. He was using all his leverage and liquidating assets to ensure he captured the majority of the company. But down in the basement of the Erie headquarters, Daniel, Drew, Jay Gould, and Jim Fisk had set up a literal printing press. They were legally printing thousands of brand new blank stock certificates. They forged the necessary signatures and flooded the Wall Street market with these completely fake shares. For days, Vanderbilt kept aggressively buying the stock. He was pouring millions of dollars into the market, but the total percentage of the company he owned was not increasing. He was completely confused. Finally, his brokerage realized what was happening. They told the Commodore that the shares he was buying were newly printed and practically worthless. He was essentially trading millions of dollars of real gold for printed toilet paper. Vanderbilt was absolutely furious. He went to a corrupt judge that he kept on his payroll and demanded an arrest warrant for Drew, Gould, and Fisk. But the 3 men found out about the warrant. They packed millions of dollars of cash into suitcases, grabbed the illegal printing press, and literally ran in the middle of the night. They rowed a boat across the Hudson River and escaped to the state of New Jersey, where the New York police had no jurisdiction. They set up a heavily armed fortress in a hotel in New Jersey, guarding the stolen money with hired thugs. It was an absolute circus. The newspapers covered the war every single day. Vanderbilt had finally met men who were willing to be more corrupt and more illegal than he was. He realized that this war was tearing the financial markets apart and severely damaging his own immense fortune. He had lost millions of dollars buying the fake stock. He decided to call for a secret truce. He met with the men and agreed to let them keep the Erie Railway, but they had to refund him all the money he lost buying the illegal shares. It was the only time in his entire life that Cornelius Vanderbilt backed down from a fight. He realized that the Erie Railway was a toxic asset run by criminals, and it was not worth destroying his own empire to acquire it. After the exhaustion of the Erie War, Vanderbilt turned his attention away from hostile takeovers and focused entirely on building his existing monopoly. He had successfully consolidated the New York and Harlem, the Hudson River Railroad, and the New York Central into one massive, incredibly efficient machine. He standardized the width of the tracks across his entire network so trains could run seamlessly from New York all the way to Chicago without stopping to change cars. He fired the corrupt middle managers and cut operational costs to the absolute bone. But he needed a monument to display his absolute power to the world. He ordered the construction of a massive train depot in the middle of Manhattan. He bought dozens of blocks of expensive city real estate and hired the best architects in the country. He built the Grand Central Depot, which would later be known as Grand Central Terminal. It was the largest enclosed space in the world at the time. It featured massive glass ceilings and intricate ironwork. He placed an enormous bronze statue of himself right at the entrance of the building, looking down at the millions of passengers who were forced to use his trains. It was the ultimate flex of corporate dominance. He had physically reshaped the geography and the architecture of the greatest city in the world to serve his own private monopoly. He brought order and absolute efficiency to a chaotic industry. His trains ran perfectly on time, and the cost of shipping freight across the country plummeted, making goods cheaper for the average consumer. But the efficiency came at the cost of total centralized dictatorial control, and the power of that control was about to be tested by a devastating economic collapse. In the year 1873, the United States economy experienced a massive and catastrophic failure. It was called the Panic of 1873. It was caused by massive overspeculation in the railroad industry. Banks had lent billions of dollars to corrupt builders who were laying tracks to nowhere in the middle of the desert, hoping to secure government land grants. When the scheme finally collapsed, the largest bank in the country failed. The stock market was forced to completely shut down for 10 days. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs. Railroad companies across the country were declaring bankruptcy every single day. But Cornelius Vanderbilt was sitting on a mountain of cash, because he never trusted banks and never engaged in wild speculation without absolute control. His empire was completely safe. While his competitors were begging for government bailouts and selling their assets for pennies, Vanderbilt saw the blood in the streets and went on the offensive. He announced that instead of firing his workers, he was going to hire thousands of more men. He started a massive construction project to build a 4-track system along the entire route of the New York Central. This meant he could have 2 tracks dedicated entirely to slow-moving freight trains, and 2 tracks dedicated entirely to high-speed passenger trains. It was an engineering marvel that cost millions of dollars. By spending massive amounts of money during an economic depression, he bought the labor and the materials at incredibly cheap prices. When the economy eventually recovered a few years later, Vanderbilt was holding the most advanced and efficient transportation system on the planet. He had completely lapped his competitors while they were starving. He effectively acted as his own central bank, stabilizing the economy of New York, while simultaneously destroying the future hopes of his rivals. He was absolute financial gravity. By 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt was 82 years old, and his health was rapidly failing. He was bedridden and incredibly bitter. He spent his final days screaming at his doctors and demanding that they cure him. But the great Commodore could not fight mortality. Before he died, he had to make the most important decision of his entire life. He had to decide what to do with his $100 million fortune. Vanderbilt had 13 children. Most wealthy men of his era would have divided their massive fortunes equally among their children to ensure everyone was comfortable. But Vanderbilt despised most of his children. He thought his sons were weak, lazy, and completely incapable of running a ruthless monopoly. He had even committed one of his sons to an insane asylum just because he disagreed with his career choices. Vanderbilt believed that if he divided his money, the empire he spent his entire life building would be chopped into small pieces and destroyed by greedy bankers. He needed one single person to inherit the throne. He chose his oldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. William Henry was a quiet, obedient man who had spent his life working diligently inside the railroad company, trying desperately to earn his father's respect. When the will was read, the family was absolutely shocked and devastated. Cornelius Vanderbilt left 95% of his entire $100 million fortune exclusively to William Henry. He gave the other children tiny, pathetic trust funds, and specifically wrote in the legal documents that if they tried to contest the will in court, they would be completely disinherited and get absolutely nothing. Even from the grave, he was enforcing absolute total monopoly. He ensured that the Vanderbilt empire remained a single, terrifying financial weapon. He died on January 4, 1877. William Henry Vanderbilt took the massive fortune and actually proved to be an incredibly competent businessman. He doubled the fortune in just 8 years, expanding the railroad network further into the West. But the subsequent generations of the Vanderbilt family completely abandoned the ruthless work ethic of the Commodore. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren did not build railroads. They built massive, incredibly expensive palaces. They built the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, which remains the largest privately owned home in the United States. They threw parties that cost millions of dollars and bought massive collections of European art. They spent the money exactly the way the Commodore feared they would. Within just a few generations, the massive fortune was completely squandered and diluted. By the mid-20th century, when a massive family reunion was held, there was not a single millionaire left among the direct descendants attending the event. The railroads were eventually bankrupted by the invention of the automobile and the airplane. The empire that held the country hostage had rusted into obscurity. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the original architect of American corporate warfare. He proved that wealth is not created by following the rules, but by exploiting the leverage that others are too afraid to use. Here are the 3 brutal lessons from his reign. Lesson 1. Control the absolute bottleneck. Vanderbilt did not need to own every single mile of railroad track in the country to maintain absolute power. He only needed to control the single bridge that crossed the river into New York. If you control the specific choke point that everyone else must pass through, you can dictate the terms of the entire industry. You let your competitors do the hard work of gathering the customers, and then you extract the value at the gate. Lesson 2. Never let sentimentality override business. Vanderbilt sold his entire magnificent fleet of steamships at the age of 70. He had spent his entire life on the water, and the ships were the source of his pride and his identity. But when he saw that iron trains were the future, he completely abandoned his past without a single second of hesitation. Emotional attachment to a dying business model is financial suicide. If the technology changes, you must pivot with absolute ruthless efficiency, even if it means destroying what you spent your life building. Lesson 3. Capital is a weapon of attrition. During the Steamboat Wars, Vanderbilt dropped his prices to zero. He was willing to bleed massive amounts of his own cash just to inflict mortal wounds on his competitors. He understood that whoever can survive without oxygen the longest will eventually own the entire ocean. He used his massive cash reserves to build during economic depressions when everything was cheap and his rivals were dying. He proved that in a truly unregulated market, the man with the most stamina and the least mercy will always take the crown.